In his infamous introductory letter to the Duke of Milan, Leonardo da Vinci mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he could also paint. This may be the greatest undersell of all time. We can hypothesize a couple of reasons for downplaying his abilities as an elite artist. First, he may have been desperate to get a job. Although the Duke of Milan ultimately used the arts as a form of soft power to avoid wielding hard power, Da Vinci would have been acutely aware that his prospective employer was primarily interested in military arts. Second, Leonardo, who clearly suffered from some form of ADHD, may have been hyper-focused on his desire to become a military engineer, neglecting to highlight his other passion: the Dunning-Kruger effect, a psychological explanation for why we overestimate our skills, could account for the over-design of the Scythe chariot, providing a third possible explanation. This occurred as the artist left Florence after having to shutter his workshop due to its failure. In this instance, Leonardo may have fallen victim to what British philosopher Bertrand Russell described as the triumph of stupidity. The British academic wrote in 1931, "The fundamental cause of the trouble is that in the modern world, the stupid are cocksure, while the intelligent are full of doubt." Perhaps the simplest explanation is that the decision to downplay his artistic skills was more complicated than we will ever fully understand. As the Scottish philosopher Shrek explains to his noble steed Donkey, individuals are complex, like onions. Not because they stink or make you cry, but because, like onions, they have layers. They are multifaceted and have many different aspects to their personalities. Leonardo da Vinci was a genius and one of the greatest painters of all time. But that doesn't mean he wanted to view himself as just a painter. Michelangelo, also a Renaissance genius, was 23 years younger than Leonardo. The two occasionally crossed paths, but these encounters were rarely pleasant, often due to Michelangelo's temperament. Michelangelo had a difficult childhood and only secured a patron after it was discovered that he had expertly forged art and pawned it off to an influential cardinal. His story is one of self-loathing and continuous feuds with others. In an attempt to turn down the extremely lucrative commission to paint the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo told the Pope that he was a sculptor, not a painter. This self-identification suggests that artists during the Renaissance could delineate between the two disciplines. Despite his pleas and behind-the-scenes encouragement from the up-and-coming painter Raphael, Michelangelo laid down his chisel and created one of history's greatest masterpieces. Meanwhile, Raphael spent 4 years profiting from the fact that Michelangelo, the world's greatest sculptor, was unavailable for hire. Beneath the curmudgeonly exterior layer of Michelangelo was another layer that revealed an incredible painter. However, at his core, he was a man who sculpted life from stone. Da Vinci, on the other hand, seemed to have far more layers than his peers. Author Will Jekyll titled his article for Forbes as Leonardo da Vinci, a study in contrasts. He points out that Da Vinci was a painter who only completed 15 works that still exist. He was a sculptor whose greatest work was never cast. He was a writer who never compiled a book. He was a gay left-handed vegetarian pacifist who waged war with one of the most notorious warriors of his or any age. He was the most famous citizen in the most famous city of the Renaissance, Florence, Italy. Yet he spent his most productive years hundreds of miles away. Despite his genius, Da Vinci likely would have struggled mightily to define who he was. He undervalued the things he could do better than anyone else on the planet, while simultaneously overvaluing things that others could have done better. His genius wasn't merely in his sheer talent or ability, but in his extreme efforts to understand the world around him. He went the extra mile, even traveling to a cemetery under the cover of darkness to illegally rob the dead of their eternal rest. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the Florentine polymath, Leonardo da Vinci. Episode number 3, The Original Renaissance Man. Effort set Leonardo da Vinci apart from his contemporaries, not in completing projects, but in obtaining a complete understanding of the unseen factors that lie beneath the surface. Where others were willing to step back and declare their masterpiece finished, he was always willing to peel back another layer, literally. Italian humanist Leon Battista Alberti published 3 books that formed the Renaissance concept of the fine arts of painting, sculpture, and architecture. His advice was that an artist should build a picture of a human body from the inside out, first conceiving of the skeleton, then the skin, then the clothing. While many artists accepted this advice metaphorically, Leonardo dissected at least 30 human corpses over the course of 2 periods of intense anatomical study. He first relied on animal dissections, as their corpses were far easier to obtain. He learned best through observation and experimentation, documenting his work in his numerous notebooks. As you would expect, the renderings are masterful, far better than any that had existed before. His process was so detail-oriented that his biggest problem was the Italian heat and lack of refrigeration, which meant he had limited time to work with each specimen. In addition to satisfying his own curiosity, his studies directly affected his art. One of his first and largest undertakings in Milan was to immortalize Duke Ludovico Sforza's father in bronze. The plan was to design a statue showing the deceased duke in full armor atop a large horse. This commission finally earned Da Vinci a salaried position within the Milan court, allowing him to move, along with his assistants, into a medieval castle near the center of town. Although it wasn't required, Leonardo intended to build a 23-foot-high statue, making it more than 3 times larger than life. Although it was designed to immortalize the rider, the artist focused almost entirely on the steed, referring to it as Il Cavallo, or the horse. He went beyond dissections in his attempt to understand his subject. Historian Walter Isaacson reveals that, as usual, Leonardo was easily distracted by related topics. While studying horses, he began plotting methods to make cleaner stables. Over the years, he would devise multiple systems for managers, with mechanisms to replenish feed bins through conduits from an attic and to remove manure using water sluice and inclined floors. For the Renaissance man, there was always an unasked-for engineering solution just out of grasp. These side quests consumed significant time and energy, understandably worrying his patrons who would have heard from their Florentine contacts about his tendency not to finish commissions. Despite this, Leonardo managed to create a full-size clay model and several drawings depicting his vision for what would be a truly majestic work of art. One of his contemporaries wrote, "Neither Greece nor Rome ever saw anything grander. See how beautiful this horse is." Leonardo da Vinci alone has created it. Sculptor, fine painter, fine mathematician, so great an intellect rarely does heaven bestow. But it remained only a model. Casting such a large design was unprecedented and would have required assembling it like Lego bricks from smaller parts. This approach didn't satisfy Da Vinci, who was concerned about visible welding lines that would detract from the grandeur of such a large structure. His solution was to cast the horse in one mold and then attach the rider on top, creating the illusion of a seamless whole from the viewer's perspective. Nothing on that scale had ever been attempted before, requiring Da Vinci to design new machines and processes to realize what was only possible in his mind. He strategically designed holes throughout the work to ensure even distribution of molten bronze, while employing 4 separate furnaces to achieve uniform cooling of the metal. He was developing methods to bury the 20-foot horse within molding sand that wouldn't disturb the water table when the project was abruptly halted because Milan found itself at war with France. The bronze allocated for glorifying the Duke's father was instead requisitioned to create 3 additional cannons. This was one of the few unfinished products that wasn't abandoned by Da Vinci himself. In most instances, it was the painter giving up on the project when it became clear that he could not achieve the level of perfection envisioned in his mind's eye. However, Il Cavallo was forcibly taken away from him, and he expressed sincere regret at not being allowed to finish his grand work. His studies showcased his prowess as a scientist. Isaacson writes that Da Vinci's empirical approach put him ahead of his time. Scholastic theologians of the Middle Ages had fused Aristotle's science with Christianity to create an authorized creed that left little room for skeptical inquiry or experimentation. Even the humanists of the early Renaissance preferred to repeat the wisdom of classical texts rather than test it. Leonardo broke with this tradition by basing his science primarily on observations, discerning patterns, and testing their validity through more observations and experiments, foreshadowing what would become the scientific method. Of course, Da Vinci doesn't receive credit for inventing the scientific method, as he never published his planned treatises on science, birds, flight, anatomy, water, or even his primary skill, painting. Galileo, born more than a century later, would be remembered as the father of modern science, despite Leonardo having implemented most of the astronomer's principles a century earlier. His anatomical studies continued, providing markers for when he completed his major works. For instance, The Last Supper, finished sometime in the 1490s, contains little of what Da Vinci would include in his later masterpieces. Intimately tied to his studies was his rendition of the Vitruvian Man. In 1489, he meticulously drew a detailed view of the human skull with veins. Beyond mere depiction, he outlined his intent to understand how eyes move and lips smile. He progressed enough to outline his intentions for an extensive anatomy treatise, stating, "This work should begin with our conception of man, describing the nature of the womb and how the fetus lives in it. Then I will describe which parts grow more than others after the baby is born, and determine the proportions of a child at 1 year. Next, describe fully grown men and women, detailing their proportions, complexion, and physiognomy. Describe how they are composed of veins, tendons, muscles, and bones. Then, in 4 drawings, represent 4 universal conditions of humanity. Mirth with various acts of laughter, and describe the cause of laughter. Weeping in various aspects and its causes. Fighting with various acts of aggression and killing. Flight, fear, ferocity, boldness, murder, and everything related to such cases. Finally, represent labor, depicting pulling, thrusting, carrying, stopping, supporting, and similar activities. Isaacson perceives genius in Leonardo's fascination with details. He writes, "Why the obsessiveness? Why the need for reams of data? Partly, at least initially, it was to help him paint humans or horses in various poses and movements. But there was something grander at play. Leonardo had set for himself the most magnificent of all tasks for the mind of mankind, nothing less than knowing fully the measure of man and how he fits into the cosmos." In his notebook, he proclaimed his intention to fathom what he called the universal measure of man. It was the quest that defined Leonardo's life, the one that tied together his art and his science. For Da Vinci, art intimately intertwined with science and mathematics, making him a proponent of STEAM education rather than STEM. While collaborating with some of Milan's elite engineers on a cathedral, Leonardo undertook the classical Renaissance challenge of depicting the Vitruvian Man. The Renaissance, often described as the rebirth of European thought, sought to revive the concepts and ideas of classical Greek and Roman civilizations. Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, a Roman engineer specializing in artillery machines, achieved fame through his sole surviving work, 10 books on architecture. Despite living over a millennium before the Renaissance, the Greeks and Romans had made discoveries that were lost for centuries. While Greek fire is a well-known example, MIT News reported in 2023 that modern efforts have revealed the secrets behind ancient Rome's remarkably durable concrete structures. It was found that volcanic ash from the Bay of Naples allowed ancient concrete to effectively self-heal. This discovery partly explains why visiting ancient Rome provides a richer experience compared to ancient Greece, where fewer structures have survived to the present day. Pollio, the Roman artillery engineer, articulated his temple design principles using an analogy that highlighted the relationship between man and the earth. He wrote, "The layout should reflect the proportions of a human body, as if the body were laid out flat on its back upon the geometric forms of the floor plan. The design of a temple depends on symmetry. There must be a precise relation between its components, akin to those of a well-shaped man." He then provided exact measurements between body parts. Many Renaissance artists undertook the challenge of bringing Pollio's descriptions to life, but Da Vinci's rendition is the most renowned. He initially considered the task during conversations with friends, but fully committed to it after one of his friends was brutally quartered by the French after their arrival in Milan. Isaacson informs us that unlike those of his friends, Leonardo's drawing is meticulously done. His lines are not sketchy and tentative. Instead, he dug hard with his stylus, carving the lines confidently into the page as if he were making an etching. He had planned this drawing very carefully and knew precisely what he was doing. Interestingly, half of his measurements are different from that of the long-deceased Roman. Leonardo had improved upon the design based upon his anatomical dissections. The inclusion of the circle and square harkened back to the beliefs of ancient thinkers who had long invested the shapes with symbolic powers. The Smithsonian magazine reveals that the circle represented the cosmic and the divine, the square the earthly and the secular. Anyone proposing that a man could be made to fit inside both shapes was making a metaphysical proposition. The human body wasn't just designed according to the principles that govern the world. It was the world in miniature. Historian Toby Lester goes even further, believing that it's an idealized self-portrait in which Leonardo stripped down to his essence, takes his own measure, and in doing so embodies timeless human hope. That we just might have the power of mind to figure out how we fit into the grand scheme of things. Think of the picture as an act of speculation, a kind of metaphysical self-portrait in which Leonardo, as an artist, a natural philosopher, and a stand-in for all of humanity, peers at himself with furrowed brow and tries to grasp the secrets of his own nature. None of it was easy. Although it wasn't technically illegal to dissect bodies for scientific purposes, it was challenging. Doug Hamilton, producer of the series Decoding Da Vinci, points out that the amateur scientists often dissected by candlelight, taking left-handed mirrored notes throughout the process. There's no refrigeration. He's sometimes doing it in the dark of night. It's a messy, smelly business. And yet, when you look at his drawings, they don't convey any of that. They convey the beauty of the body. He performed most of these experiments at night. Da Vinci adhered to his own sleep schedule, now known as the polyphasic sleep process, which involves 20-minute power naps throughout the 24-hour day. According to the article Sleeping Like a Genius on the Campbell County Health website, this system results in about 5 hours of sleep every 24 hours. It also meant that Da Vinci was awake at times when most shops would be closed. Da Vinci, Nikola Tesla, and Thomas Edison all challenged the notion that traditional sleep patterns were beneficial to their health and mental well-being. However, before you consider altering your own routine, note that Albert Einstein believed firmly in the importance of a consistent period of sleep for his studies. He averaged more than 10 hours of sleep each night. Dissecting cadavers during the night meant fewer interruptions, but it led to a situation that would have scared the heebie-jeebies out of most people. The American Journal of Cardiology explains, "Few physicians today have read or even heard of Leonardo's descriptions of the circumstances under which he worked. There were no chemicals to preserve the cadavers, which began to decompose before there was time to examine and draw them properly. You will perhaps be impeded by your stomach, and if this does not impede you, you will perhaps be impeded by the fear of living through the night hours in the company of these corpses, quartered and flayed and frightening beyond belief. One single body was not sufficient, so it was necessary to proceed little by little with as many bodies as would render complete knowledge. These conditions occasionally required hiring a grave robber or two, although Da Vinci preferred working with medical students who were learning dissection techniques in Milan. This didn't make him a mad scientist, as he remained sensitive in all other instances to human dignity. He simply did not believe that the human essence remained with the body after death. One of his most influential dissections involved a 100-year-old man who had confided in the artist that he had never been sick. After quickly striking up a friendship, the centenarian agreed to allow Leonardo the opportunity to examine him post-mortem. The result was Leonardo's discovery of arterial hardening, a key factor in strokes and heart attacks. He also accurately depicted the human heart, demonstrating its 4 separate chambers and its role as the muscle responsible for circulating blood. Prior to his findings, Renaissance scientists believed that blood was produced in the liver, and they attributed special life-giving properties to the heart. His detailed drawings proved invaluable. British heart surgeons later used them to redesign an artificial heart valve that significantly improved upon existing designs. During this period, Leonardo continued painting, with one of his most famous works being The Virgin of the Rocks. Like the Vitruvian Man, this painting was attempted by several artists. Stanford University explains, the Bible had a profound influence on the Renaissance, spanning architecture, art, theology, and philosophy. For Renaissance scholars, the Bible served not only as a religious text, but also as a subject of study. Artists in particular relied heavily on biblical narratives, often receiving commissions for religious-themed paintings destined for churches. Leonardo himself was renowned for his ability to breathe life into biblical scenes, transforming textual descriptions into vivid visual representations. There is substantial circumstantial evidence suggesting that Da Vinci didn't believe in Christianity, opting instead to place his faith in science. However, he did not appear to oppose others holding Christian beliefs. Art historian Anna Swartwood House has extensively studied the evolving portrayal of Jesus Christ from 1350 AD to 1600 AD. It was during the Renaissance that the enduring image of Jesus as a white European emerged. The Bible provides little direct information about Jesus' physical appearance, describing him simply as a son of Judah. Richard Neve, a British forensic expert, suggests that genetically, Jesus would likely have had tan, olive-toned skin and dark curly hair cropped close to his head. In that era, most men were clean-shaven, and depictions of Jesus only began to include a beard around the 4th century AD. A recently discovered fresco dating back to 235 AD portrays Jesus with short hair and no beard, challenging later artistic conventions. Without a clearly defined image, civilizations depict their savior as though he was a part of their own lineage. This began when the Byzantines enshrined him as a younger version of Zeus. The Italian Renaissance artists drew him as an Italian, while the Ethiopians depicted him as black. As the universalizing faith began its attempted conversion of the subcontinent, Jesus popped up with Indian features. In the 20th century, the Nazis attempted to distance Jesus from all Jewish traits, providing extremely light skin and blue eyes to their depictions. Da Vinci wasn't a well-traveled man, having only ventured beyond the Italian peninsula late in his life, and even then only to France. While we cannot definitively ascertain his thought process behind depicting Jesus, we do know he was commissioned to paint biblical figures for his patrons. In such cases, artists typically catered to their clients' expectations, and Italians wanted to see a Christ who resembled someone familiar. This is evident in Da Vinci's portrayal in The Last Supper, his second most famous work. According to records, Da Vinci frequented Milan's prisons to find a suitable model for his depiction of Judas. Gasparo Visconti, a friend of Leonardo's, humorously criticized him in a poem for possibly portraying himself as both Thomas and James the Lesser at the table of Christ. His anatomy studies narrowed for a time down to a focus on optics. For this study, he looked through his own eyes as well as those of the deceased in order to better understand how humans perceived the world around them. His interest in the subject resulted in a number of paintings, including the optical Da Vinci effect, where it appears as though the subject's eyes follow the viewer as they move throughout the room. His optic studies also enabled him to achieve linear perspective, balancing the foreground and the background. His unique fumato technique, which blurred the edges with smoke, was essential to the process. The key to Da Vinci's happy little trees was to leave out the details. The artist himself explains that the painter, therefore, who delineates the outlines and the tiny details of parts, as several have done, will not accurately depict distant objects, but by this error will make them exceedingly near. In another notebook, Da Vinci draws a receding row of trees, with each one losing a tiny bit of detail until the ones at the horizon are completely devoid of branches. Mastering optics was key to the beauty that is The Last Supper. The commission was handed down by Duke Ludovico in 1495, yet prints of the completed work are ubiquitous in the gift shops of art museums around the world. These images, however, fail to capture the majesty of Da Vinci's original work, which was designed to sit in the meal hall of a local Dominican monastery. As such, the commissioned work stands 15 feet high and is an incredible 29 feet wide. Mathematically, Leonardo figured out that the proper viewing distance from the wall would be 300 to 600 feet back. But considering that it was permanently stationed in a small dining hall, he set about creating an artificial ideal vantage point that would be 30 feet from the wall. He also created a perspective that looks natural when you walk in through the door on the right wall. This vantage point, according to Isaacson, meant that the monk's first striking perception was that of Jesus' left hand. palm up, directed right at them, as if welcoming them into the room. The masterpiece captures Jesus disclosing to his disciples that one of them will betray him before the night is done. That revelation sets the room into a blur of emotion that is beautifully captured by Da Vinci through the gestures of the men surrounding their Lord. Isaacson beautifully describes the scene for us, writing that the drama begins the second after Jesus' words have been spoken. His head is bowed in silence, even as his hands are continuing their movement towards the bread. Like a stone thrown into a pond, his pronouncement causes ripples outward, spreading from him to the edges of the picture and creating a narrative reaction. In preparation for the work, Leonardo discreetly studied the gestures that individuals were making while arguing throughout the city's restaurants. His ever-present notebook captured ideas that would be dutifully executed within the Dominican dining room. The details are astounding, with eels, a favorite meal of Da Vinci, gracing the serving plates. Judas, the betrayer, holds a bag of silver, while Peter holds the knife that he will later use to slice off the ear of a servant of a high priest who came to arrest Jesus. Dan Brown sparked renewed interest in the painting by featuring it prominently in his fictional historical narrative, The Da Vinci Code. Brown's novel weaves a mystery around the central thesis of the nonfiction book, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. In that work, historians Michael Bagnet, Richard Ley, and Henry Lincoln allege that Jesus married Mary Magdalene, had one or more children, whose descendants emigrated to southern France in order to become the elite Merovingian dynasty via the ultra-secret society known as the Priory of Sion. I haven't read their work myself, but several independent investigators, including 60 Minutes, the Discovery Channel, Time Magazine, and the BBC, have all concluded that authors' claims are neither credible nor verifiable. On the other hand, I have read The Da Vinci Code and can highly recommend it. Brown's work of fiction places Leonardo da Vinci in on the conspiracy, allowing the book's main character, Harvard symbologist Robert Langdon, to uncover the clues throughout the world of Renaissance art. The Last Supper features prominently in the caper, with Langdon believing that the depiction of John is actually Mary Magdalene. The symbologist also calls out the large V-shaped empty space between the two, suggesting that it was symbolic of the Holy Grail, their supposed child, and symbol of the female womb. In the non-conspiratorial context, Leonardo da Vinci's depictions of men as androgynous reflects the Renaissance ideals of beauty. This style was prevalent during that era, where artists often portrayed male figures with delicate and effeminate features. For instance, if you look at Raphael's self-portrait, you will see an incredibly effeminate man that could have been the long-distant relative of Timothée Chalamet. In spite of, or perhaps because of his effeminate looks, Raphael was one of the great womanizers of any age, regularly placing the likeness of the woman whose heart he was attempting to momentarily capture within his latest masterpiece. This has to be one of the greatest moves in history, bringing a woman on a first date to an art gallery where you reveal in front of the assembled audience your latest masterpiece, which includes for eternity the young lady's beauty and grace. But just because it's a great move doesn't mean that you have to repeat it over and over again, as Raphael was known to, as he died at the age of 37, reportedly because of a night of excessive romance. Historian Jean-Pierre Isbouts points out that Da Vinci was interested in androgynous characters throughout his career. He identifies the work Angelo Incarnato as an example of a transgender angel in the midst of transitioning, as well as Leonardo's later work in John the Baptist sitting in what was then a provocative feminine position. Opposite of Michelangelo, who never saw a space that he couldn't fit a naked dude into, Da Vinci seemed to take particular pleasure in painting women. The Sydney Morning Herald writes that Leonardo's own sexuality appears to transcend gender, to slip into godlike fantasies of androgynous liaisons between worlds. No other Renaissance artist was as preoccupied with androgyny. From his earliest works, including an angel he painted in a work by his master, it was Leonardo's trademark. We know that the Renaissance artist used a woman as his model for John in the Last Supper, but the reason why he made such a choice is unfortunately lost to history. One thing is certain, however, as this bout informs us that Mary Magdalene was one of the Dominican order's leading patron saints. As such, she appears prominently at the center of Mantrofano's crucifixion on the opposite wall of the Last Supper. It is safe to say that if the Gospels had put her in the Last Supper scene, the Dominicans would have insisted she be included as well. But the Gospels are very explicit. The Last Supper was shared only by Jesus and the 12 apostles. Any deviation from this iconographic program would have constituted a breach with the Gospel tradition, and that is something the Dominicans, guardians of Catholic orthodoxy, could never have approved of. From the start, work on the Last Supper was beset by disasters. Da Vinci was deeply interested in the science of art, carefully selecting canvas materials that would accentuate the images he created. He preferred canvas over the typical wooden panels that were commonly used until the beginning of the 16th century. Even when Leonardo chose to use wood paneling, as he did for the Mona Lisa, he charted his own course by using popular wood instead of the more commonly preferred walnut. For the Last Supper, however, he would have to paint a fresco, which required wet plaster to be applied directly to the surface and then painted over before it was dry. Isaacson explains the problem for us, writing that when Leonardo used oil paint, he would apply a stroke or two, touch and retouch, meditate for a while, then add a few more layers until he had it perfect. This permitted him to show subtle gradations and shadows and blur the borders of objects. His strokes were so light and layered that individual brushstrokes are imperceptible, and he sometimes waited hours or days before gently adding more thin layers and retouching. Unfortunately, this leisurely process was not a luxury allowed to the painter on a typical wall fresco, which required that the paint be applied onto wet plaster in order to remain fixed. Once a patch of plaster had been put on a wall, that area of the painting had to be completed in one day's session before it dried and could not easily be reworked later. Verrocchio, who did not paint frescoes, never taught the technique to his students, and it was clearly unsuited to Leonardo's unhurried style. By this point in his career, Da Vinci had acquired a reputation leading to daily spectators arriving at the monastery to watch him paint. One priest recounts that Leonardo would come here in the early hours of the morning and mount the scaffolding, and then remain there brush in hand from sunrise to sunset, forgetting to eat or drink, painting continually. Yet on other days, the mercurial artist would show up and just stand in silence for hours contemplating the painting in his mind. On other days, he would arrive unannounced in the middle of the day, climb the scaffolding, seize a brush, apply a brush stroke or two to one of the fingers, only to then suddenly depart. Such days resulted in a number of conflicts between the artist and the Duke, who began to panic that the Last Supper would become yet another one of Da Vinci's unfinished works. Such confrontations only hindered the process, resulting in the artist claiming that he never wanted to pick up a paintbrush again. After one lengthy confrontation, he talked down to his boss, proclaiming that men of lofty genius sometimes accomplish the most when they work the least. He completed the work in 1498, nearly 4 years after he had begun. It was absolutely breathtaking and proceeded to draw a number of Renaissance celebrities who invaded the monk's dining hall in order to catch a glimpse. Part of the reason that the mural popped was because of Leonardo's willingness to experiment with new paints. For this particular work, Da Vinci concocted a unique mixture of oil and water-based pigments, which he believed would last significantly longer. In this instance, he was quite wrong, as the paint began to flake and fade within 2 decades. By the time that his first biography was being written, the painting had been deemed ruined. Isaacson even reveals that by 1652 the painting was so faint and dissipated that the monks felt comfortable breaking a doorway through the wall at the bottom, cutting off the feet of Jesus, which were probably crossed in a manner prefiguring the crucifixion. There have been 6 major attempts at restoring the Last Supper, but several of these efforts have only worsened its condition. One restorer, misunderstanding the nature of the fresco, even attempted to remove it completely from the wall, not realizing that the painting was literally a part of the wall. Despite these setbacks, the city of Milan appreciated the work so much that it commissioned numerous copies to preserve the original for posterity. These prints have managed to capture the spirit and beauty of the original. Art critic Michael Daly notes that the latest restoration resulted in a distinctly mongrel work, showing alarmingly little original paint. The Cenacolo Vinciano, a museum dedicated to the Last Supper, explains that the iconography of Da Vinci's Last Supper, which had already begun to spread beyond the borders of Milan at the beginning of the 16th century through engravings and copies, influenced many artists who painted the Last Supper after Leonardo, producing pieces of art that cannot be defined as replicas. This legacy of imitation continues among modern artists, including American Andy Warhol, India's Francis Newton Sousa, Japan's Madasky, and China's Zheng Fangzi. Despite creating a universally lauded masterpiece, Da Vinci did not find himself suddenly thrust upon easy street. During this period, he faced personal and professional challenges. His mother passed away, the bronze prepared for Il Cavallo was repurposed for cannons, and he had to take on interior design work for wealthy Milanese residents to make ends meet. Financial strain was so severe that at one point he wrote to the Duke, who was preoccupied with defending the city from the French, suggesting that perhaps your excellency did not give further orders to pay me, believing that I had money enough. It vexes me greatly that having to earn my living has forced me to interrupt the work and to attend to small matters, instead of following up the work which your lordship entrusted to me. When Ludovico eventually fled Milan after a French breakthrough, the situation initially worried the city's most famous artist. However, the arrival of the French turned out to be beneficial for Da Vinci. While mobs destroyed the homes of many of his friends and looted their treasures, his study was spared after the French king visited the Last Supper. The only exception was the clay model for his gigantic bronze horse, which became a pincushion for French archers who found it excellent for target practice. Da Vinci initially worked with his new French overlords for a few months before departing for Florence as a friend. It was early 1500, and he had been away from the city of his childhood for 18 years. The journey south included a number of ADHD-style distractions, such as offering unsolicited advice to Venice on using a system of locks to flood the plain in the case of a Turkish invasion. During this time, he also dreamed up scuba diving equipment for a corps of underwater soldiers to sink an invading fleet. Determined to overcome his past reputation as someone who accomplished little, his 6 years in Florence became the most productive period of his life. He completed several portraits, including Madonna of the Yarnwinder and the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. The Louvre, which displays the Mona Lisa, proclaimed in 2012 that the image of St. Anne was Da Vinci's ultimate masterpiece. The commission was secured by Leonardo's elderly father, whose connections as a notary continued to be used on behalf of his illegitimate son. The image depicts an infant Jesus wrestling with a baby goat while St. Anne sits with her daughter, the Virgin Mary. Another piece of art from this period, Leda and the Swan, has unfortunately been lost, but multiple copies from his studio suggest that Leonardo finished his own version. One story out of France suggests that it was purposefully destroyed for garnering too much attention from Madame de Montenay's husband. The copies of the work show a naked woman being seduced by Zeus in the form of a swan. The mythological version of the story goes further, teaching that the result of such a coupling was Leda producing 2 eggs, from which hatched 2 sets of twins, including Helen of Troy, as well as Castor and Pollux. His unexpected proficiency in completing works of art hit a metaphorical brick wall upon his acceptance of a commission to paint the Battle of Aglahari in 1503. Leonardo, now 51 years old, had accepted the commission unaware that the 29-year-old Michelangelo would soon accept a parallel commission to depict the same conflict on literally the same wall. There is no doubt that Michelangelo took the job in order to spite his elder. He had just unveiled his David statue, which remains widely accepted as the world's greatest sculpture. Although it had been designed for a niche within the upper echelons of the Cathedral of Florence, it was deemed too beautiful to waste in the rafters. Florence appointed a commission to determine the David's fate, with the majority agreeing with the young artist that it should be predominantly placed in the piazza in front of the Piazza della Signora. Leonardo, on the other hand, and keep in mind here that he had just recently painted an image of a woman and a swan that some believed to be pornographic, argued publicly that the David should be hidden within a parapet by some old dusty tapestries. He also went out of his way to design a bronze fig leaf to cover up David's private parts. The resulting gilded garment made of brass and 28 copper leaves was indeed placed upon Michelangelo's breathtaking work, remaining there for at least 40 years. As I've said before, Michelangelo liked painting, sculpting, and imagining nude dudes. Unlike Leonardo, he refused to accept his internal urges and obliged himself into a life of celibacy and denial. Towards the end of his incredible life, he again flew into a rage when someone decided to censor his artistic instincts. The Last Judgment covers the entire altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. The stunning mural is an incredible 39 feet tall and 45 feet wide, more than double the size of Da Vinci's Last Supper. The work of art, which remains breathtaking to this day, includes 300 biblical figures, as well as Michelangelo himself, portrayed as an empty husk being held by St. Bartholomew just to the right of center. The finished work was full of nudity, something that Cardinal Biagio de Cesena brought to the Pope's attention before its official unveiling. The cardinal went so far as to say that the artwork was more suited for the public baths and taverns than the Sistine Chapel. The Pope reluctantly ordered the artist to remove the offending portions, leaving Michelangelo incensed. While reworking his masterpiece to cover up the nudity, he chose to portray the cardinal's face prominently and accurately as Minos, the judge of the underworld, adding to the insult of portraying a powerful man of the cloth as residing in hell as an active agent of the devil. Michelangelo gave Decina donkey ears. In order to ensure that it was appropriate for a church setting, he covered up the man's genitals by painting a snake, sinking its fangs into the offending male region. When the Last Judgment was finally unveiled, the cardinal's peers let loose a roar of laughter when they realized what had been done. There, in the bottom right-hand corner, was an exact replica of the cardinal's face. The cardinal demanded that the Pope do something, but Paul III proclaimed that he had no authority over hell, and therefore couldn't intervene. Approaching his third decade on Earth, Michelangelo chafed at being constantly referred to as the next Leonardo, and channeled his rage towards besting the man in direct competition. As you would expect, this wasn't the type of setting that the calm and collected Da Vinci excelled in. The battle was to be painted along a 174-foot wall that served as the meeting chamber for the ruling council of Florence. Leonardo chose to depict the climax of the battle, focusing intimately upon the men and their horses fighting for control of the battle standard. Not knowing that it was to be a competition, he squandered his head start on Michelangelo, focusing his preparatory work largely on how the smoke of the artillery and dust kicked up by the horses would be portrayed. He went so deep into his preparatory drawings, which were breathtaking, that the people of Florence again whispered about his proclivity at not finishing things. In one passive-aggressive act, his benefactors paid him in small coins, resulting in him shouting at them that he was not a penny painter. In 1504, his benefactors revised the contract so that he would be forced to repay all his fees and forfeit all the work he had done if he wasn't finished by February 1505. That got him moving finally, and after engineering the world's first known scissors-like platform which could be raised by contracting and lowered by expanding, he got to work. Unfortunately, he experienced a repeat of the problems that had confounded him during his work on the Last Supper. His unique mixture of paint wouldn't allow him to achieve the nuances that he had intended. He missed his deadline, but continued to diligently work on it. Isaacson notes that by the summer of 1505, Leonardo could feel the pressure of a younger man looking over his shoulder, both literally and figuratively. Michelangelo had chosen another tangential scene to the large-scale battle, painting more than a dozen muscular and naked men who were frantically emerging from their bath in a river to respond to an ambush. Leonardo was disgusted by the choices that were made by his peer. Isaacson writes that Leonardo rarely criticized other painters, but after seeing Michelangelo's bathing nudes, he repeatedly disparaged what he called the anatomical painter. Clearly referring to his rival, he mocked those who draw their nude figures looking like wood, devoid of grace, so that you would think you were looking at a sack of walnuts rather than the human form, or a bundle of radishes rather than the muscles of figures. There is no doubt that Michelangelo was one of the greatest painters that the world has ever seen. It is also true that he was probably the single greatest sculptor in the history of the world, with La Pietra serving as my personal favorite piece of art. But he hadn't put in the same meticulous work that Leonardo had at understanding how to bring paintings to life. Michelangelo had never been to war. He hadn't performed dissections by candlelight to figure out how different muscles were connected. And he certainly hadn't come to grips with the subconscious choices that directed his artistic decisions. The two men fundamentally disagreed with each other, choosing opposite sides regarding the Renaissance debate over which form of art, painting or sculpting, was superior. Leonardo argued that painting embraces and contains within itself all things perceptible in nature, which the poverty of sculpture cannot do, such as show the colors of all things and how they dim. The painter will demonstrate various distances by the variation of color of the air interposed between objects and the eye. He will demonstrate how the species of objects penetrate mists with difficulty. He will demonstrate how mountains and valleys are seen through clouds in the rain. He will demonstrate dust itself and how the combatants raise a commotion in it. Although it was said later in life, Michelangelo knew that some of Leonardo's critiques were ultimately correct, admitting in a poem about his work on the Sistine Chapel that I am not in the right place and I am not a painter. The younger Renaissance genius was the first to abandon his project, accepting a summons from Pope Julius II to sculpt the pontiff's tomb. His absence resulted in Leonardo pursuing his work with a renewed fury. Although the direct competition with the younger Michelangelo likely kept him going far longer than he would have otherwise, Leonardo eventually gave up and abandoned the project in May of 1505. It is believed that the difficulty in getting his paint to stick, the impossible challenge of creating a vantage point for an image so large, and the pressures of competition all caused him to abandon the project and depart from Florence, once again with the reputation of not finishing his work. Isaacson tells us that he was a perfectionist faced with challenges other artists would have disregarded, but that he could not. So he put down his brushes. That behavior meant he would never again receive a public commission. But it was also what allowed him to go down in history as an obsessed genius, rather than merely a reliable master painter. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowry@gmail.com, or find us on the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.